Coming up, Prime Minister Liz Truss has been every bit as disastrous as I've predicted in previous videos. And true to form, with the British economy in a self-inflicted crisis and the IMF pleading with Truss to reverse her tax cuts as she cowers away from public view, her government are branding the IMF, the Bank of England and the traditionally conservative British media as woke lefties. After 12 years of blaming the last Labour government for all their mistakes, this populist hard-right government are now blaming market reaction to their ideological fiscal nonsense on the next Labour government under Keir Starmer. And although the incompetence of Kwarteng and the dogma of Truss have tanked the UK economy, they and we would not be where we are today without Brexit fanning the flames. And by happy coincidence, my usual end-of-month Brexit roundup is due. So in this video, I'll be explaining the fundamental link between Brexit and the current economic crisis. Stay tuned. If you enjoy watching my videos, please give this one a like and spread the word by sharing a link on your favoured social media platforms. If you subscribe, you can also hit the bell icon to be notified of each new video I release. Just imagine if Brexit had never happened. The gruesome twosome at numbers 10 and 11 could have blamed this entire economic meltdown on the EU. Instead, they're having to blame it on the media, talking Britain down, or on Sir Keir Starmer for suddenly looking like a proper Prime Minister in waiting, or on the war in Ukraine somehow affecting the UK more than any other European country apart from Russia or Ukraine itself. Or blaming the crisis on the Bank of England and international currency and bond markets for being part of a woke lefty plot conspiring against conservative politics. Or to put it simply, reality itself is, apparently, conspiring against Trussonomics. But the truth is, since 2016, this execrable government have been relying on mythical Brexit freedoms to clinch amazing trade deals with the USA and other major economies, to replace those billions in trade we lost when leaving the EU. But Brexiteers soon discovered that Britain is free to sign up to those trade deals in very much the same way that Therese Coffey is free to date will.i.am. So in the midst of this economic crisis, let's take a moment to reflect on the current state of Brexit. If we can find a clean enough stretch of water to reflect in, what with all the sewage leakage caused directly by Truss's efficiency savings while she was Environment Minister, implementing the philosophy laid out in her book, Britannia Undrained. You might at first think that Brexit has precious little to do with the absolute skipfire that is the British economy. But you'd be wrong. Sure, the Tory apologists in the media are telling us that it's the Bank of England's fault for saying they won't hesitate to raise interest rates further, while hesitating to raise interest rates further. The right-wing tabloids will have you believe that the EU has it even worse, or that the whole crisis is down to the strength of the dollar. And as the pound falls and the cost of government borrowing skyrockets, you see even some Tory MPs blaming it squarely on Truss and Kwarteng's dogmatic implementation of a discredited economic ideology. But the more audacious Tory supporters wearing their tinfoil hats, Union Jack undercrackers and blue and white football scarves blame the 2022 economic crisis squarely on Gordon Brown, the man who managed to hold the British economy together during the subprime mortgage global financial crisis in 2008. But amongst all these myriad whipping boys, Brexit is getting barely a mention. We have a leader of the opposition beginning to find his mojo, but still following the "make Brexit work" mantra. And of course, the Tories themselves are still in denial that Brexit is making the nation poorer, despite overwhelming evidence from the government's own Office for Budget Responsibility and the Office for National Statistics, not to mention evidence from every single economist on the planet, save Truss's chosen economic advisor, the batshit crazy Patrick. But on the plus side, and I think history will show that this is really important, the polls are now consistently telling us that there is a growing, if slow, realisation amongst the British public that Brexit has been a significant factor in our economic woes since leaving the EU. I think also that people are beginning to see a link between the extreme and dogmatic hard Tory Brexit, seeing Leave.eu promises over freedom of movement, plus remaining in the customs union, single market and Erasmus, all being smashed on the altar of Brexit extremism, and now seeing that same kind of extremism reflected in the gobsmacking fiscal event brought to you by Truss-Kwarteng. It's easy to spot the commonality. The market backlash to all the tax cuts demonstrates that financial experts don't see post-Brexit Britain as a safe place to invest. And think about it from their point of view. UK trade with its biggest trading partner, the EU, has crashed. Non-tariff barriers continue to disrupt both imports and exports. Truss has appointed self-styled Brexit hardmen Steve Baker and Chris Heaton-Harris to the Northern Ireland office to continue the Tory policy of confrontation with the EU. The various overhyped trade deals that Truss boasts about have added sod all to GDP, while Kwarteng and Truss prove to the world through their actions that they are economically illiterate. No wonder that the world's financial institutions have got the message that Britain is not the blue-chip investment it was before Brexit. With the sole exception of supporters of the Tories who have their Conservative Party scarf knotted so tightly around their necks that it's cut off the supply of blood to their brains, everyone else can see that the Britannia Unchained ideology of class warfare is far more important to the Truss government than economic success or the well-being of the British population as a whole. And that's even before the next stage of their dogmatic project. Stand by for imminent cost-cutting announcements that will represent the wholesale butchering of the public sector through stringent cuts to services, including the long-suffering NHS, social care, welfare support, and the already not fit-for-purpose justice system. There's going to be a sustained attack on all public sector operations by these swivel-eyed, ideologically corrupted free market zealots. The memory of that infamous promise on the side of the Brexit bus to give an extra £350 million a week to the NHS still shocks in its dishonesty and audacity. The more so as we now know that the hard Tory stroke UKIP Brexit we ended up with is on course to reduce GDP by 4% a year, every year, for the next 15 years. I know many Brexit voters who claim this was not the Brexit they voted for. But the damage is done. It was certainly the Brexit that you and I voted against. Brexit was never going to be good, but the extreme Brexit that Johnson and David Frost negotiated and then implemented in such a badly botched fashion has severely weakened the UK economy's resistance to financial shocks. And that is a fundamental part of why the market horses were so badly spooked by Kwarteng's incontinent tax cuts, and why the pound plunged to an all-time low against the US dollar. And yes, I know the US dollar is particularly strong right now, but sterling's drop has been spectacular. But it wasn't really a sudden drop. Ever since Brexit, the pound's slide against the US dollar and other leading currencies has been a concern, as it's made imports more expensive, while at the same time British exports have tumbled. And this is a major cause of the high inflation rates the UK is currently suffering. The post-Brexit agricultural labour shortages and subsequent food price rises have also added to inflationary pressures. The idea of Brexit itself made no sense in economic terms. It seemed theoretically like the first time in history that a nation had imposed economic sanctions on itself, and so it has proved in reality. Leave voters leaving comments on this channel are always at pains to insist that Brexit was never about economics, despite all the promises of sunlit uplands, £350 million a week for the NHS, global Britain trading across the planet, and compliant German car makers. But Truss and Kwarteng's blatant disregard for fiscal prudence should be viewed as a natural progression of this purported lack of interest in sound economics that has been the Brexit Conservative government's attitude ever since the 2016 referendum. The offshore Leave campaign sponsors and donors demanded this couldn't-care-less attitude to the economy so as not to hinder progress towards their ideal of a tax-cutting strategy, allowing the rich to get richer and sod the poor. or as they call it, deregulated free market economics. Oh, unless the poor are actually listening, in which case they call it trickle-down economics, a scenario in which wealth doesn't actually trickle down to the poorest, it just flows out to offshore tax havens, as illustrated by this graphic. The logical endpoint as far as tax is concerned was Kwarteng's budget that wasn't a budget, so didn't need to be accompanied by the analysis drafted by the Office of Budget Responsibility. And you can bet your bottom, let's go with dollar given the state of the pound, that when the OBR report finally sees the light of day, that Kwarteng, Truss and the other European research group puppets will say that the OBR have it all wrong, and will also probably accuse them of boring economic orthodoxy, or maybe of being woke, or of being part of a Corbynite conspiracy against conservative economics, or maybe just call them snowflakes. Again, it comes back to Brexit and proponents like Michael Gove and his immortal line, "We've had enough of experts." That's populism in a nutshell. And it's meant 6 years of undermining the very institutions that provide political and economic stability. Things like calling High Court judges the enemies of the people, gaslighting the public into believing that the BBC and Channel 4 are lefty conspiracists, unlawfully suspending Parliament to avoid scrutiny of the Brexit bill and then lying to the Queen about it, eroding checks and balances by rewriting the ministerial code and getting rid of the government's own ethics advisor, frustrating freedom of information requests on VIP lanes to issue lucrative PPE contracts and other corrupt payments to Tory donors and cronies. No wonder that in this post-Brexit environment, investors start to panic when fiscal orthodoxy is jettisoned in a non-costed budget that's not a budget, that's completely at odds with the Tory manifesto of 2019. Truss and Kwarteng do not have a mandate for these decisions from their own party, let alone the British electorate. Though even now, many Tories prefer to blame the Bank of England for not doing more to protect the country from their own government's fiscal incompetence. Everyone else is always to blame. It's never their fault. They never apologise, gaslighting the British public as if the Conservatives as a party are suffering from collective narcissistic personality disorder. Another reason that Brexit is not front and centre of the debate on this economic crisis is because of Labour's pathetic stance on the issue. Starmer's Make Brexit Work mantra is their plan to tempt red wall voters to return to the Labour fold at the next election. But this lack of leadership over Brexit by both Corbyn, it pains me to say, and now Starmer, has led to me and thousands of others cancelling their Labour Party membership. And as the real-time catastrophe of Brexit manifests itself through an ever-worsening economic environment, the Make Brexit Work mantra becomes ever more ludicrous. Brexit is the fuel in the tank of the disastrous Trussonomics. Disastrous? I think so. It's blindingly obvious to every non-Tory scarf wearer, including those 8.3 million voters with mortgages, that the Tories have messed up big time on the economy. And a fundamental part of that is they messed up the implementation of Brexit. Now, I would of course argue that any Brexit would have been bad for Britain, but this extreme Tory Brexit, implemented in a half-assed way with open borders for EU imports because it would be too expensive to control them.
I thought post-Brexit checks were not going to be disruptive.
That's why we're not adopting them. This would have been an act of self-harm if we'd gone ahead with it. It would have increased costs for people, and we are trying to reduce costs. So that's the purpose of not going ahead with them and trying to ensure that the border flows as smoothly as possible, which benefits everybody. Free trade is hugely advantageous to consumers.
That's the worst of all possible Brexits. Truss won the leadership by promising to double down on Brexit and to confront economic orthodoxy. And she's lived up to those promises that sane people assumed were just part of her rhetoric to win over the hard right-wing Tory membership. Her other promises during the leadership campaign to implement public sector spending cuts are probably the next thing we shall see implemented. Because judging by her sputtering all-at-sea interviews on local radio this week and her desperate tweet about her conversation with Ukrainian President Zelensky, the Trussatron has installed the full-on panic mode module, and is now programmed to listen only to those who pull her strings, like her personal financial backers from the fossil fuel industry, and the shady zealots from the Institute of Economic Affairs, whose financial backers are said to largely be the same people backing Donald Trump in the States. Plus her enablers within the Tory party, their own doomsday sect, Rees-Mogg's so-called European Research Group, who are actually anti-European and who do precious little research, but who nevertheless we the public fund through taxation. These are the people who are really running the country right now, and Truss and Kwarteng are merely the robots carrying out their instructions. The Truss government will inevitably crash and burn over the coming weeks. For those of us opposed to both Brexit and the extreme right-wing policies it spawned, from Rwanda to tax cuts for the rich, it can't come a moment too soon. It's just a shame for the millions of us who will lose our savings or struggle through the winter having to choose between heating and eating, hoping that we have no need to rely on an already desperately underfunded NHS facing further cuts. People will die this winter as a direct result of this uncaring government's policies. The visceral implementation of the post-Brexit ideology of Britannia Unchained, the morally and economically indefensible Trussonomics.